Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tom's Hardware Show. It is October 1st, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, which means it's time to go live. Yes, welcome, everybody. We are live, and as always, we are taking questions from the viewers. So if you have anything you'd like to ask our guests today, put your question in the chat on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll be answering questions by the end of the show.
Woo-woo.
Woo-woo. So let's meet our guests. First, we have Michelle Earhart, Tom's Hardware staff writer extraordinaire. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. I've been working on a Tiger Lake review.
Nice. So Michelle does a lot for us. You do laptop reviews, you do news, you do so much. What's been going on this week? Mostly Tiger Lake for you?
Yeah, so I've been working on the new ZenBook 13 from ASUS, which is actually the second ZenBook 13 that I've looked at in a few months. The last one was a Comet Lake one, but this one is my very first Tiger Lake system, and I'm pretty impressed.
So the Comet Lake would have been faster, but heavier, I assume? I don't know.
We'll get into that later on.
Stay tuned, Jared. Speaking of, Jared's also our guest. Jared Walton, senior editor, king of all things graphics. What's going on?
It's been a busy 2 weeks since the RTX 30 series started launching. So I've been testing and retesting some more. We got the press drivers about a week, maybe week and a half before launch for the 3080, and I did testing, and the 3080 Founders Edition worked fine. Then I shifted over to a couple of custom AIB cards, and the ASUS card worked okay, and then I tested the MSI card, and I was getting crashing, and I was like, okay, so you start this back and forth because it's brand new hardware. Sometimes you even have pre-release cards. You can't guess for sure and say this is the cause, even though the internet loves to do that. So back and forth a little bit. MSI says, hey, try the updated drivers. So the public drivers came out at launch, 456.38, and those fixed my problem with the ASUS card. The MSI card. The ASUS card was fine. And then I started testing 3090. And the 3090 FE also worked fine. And then I tested a Gigabyte 3090 Founders Edition and an ASUS 3090 Tough Gaming OC. And the Gigabyte definitely had some crashing issues, and the ASUS worked fine in its default mode, which is it's called gaming mode. But if you want to run in the advertised factory overclocked mode, so gaming mode is factory overclocked, but then there's an extra overclock that you could get with if you install the ASUS GPU Tweak 2 software, and then you have to go in and say, hey, apply the OC mode. And so I hadn't done that before. I applied that mode and started crashing, and it's only 30 megahertz more, but so it's like, okay, the crashing problems were real, but again, you still don't know the cause. And beginning of this week, Nvidia shipped out a new 456.55 driver and says it improves stability, and it did. So after many hours of retesting, I've got numbers for I think all of the RTX 30 cards I've been shipped so far, and they're all running stable at the factory overclocked settings. Obviously, if you push them beyond and start manually overclocking, you're kind of on your own there. But and performance didn't drop. I should be clear that the performance with the latest drivers was the same. So that's kind of the big news for graphics.
Well, let me ask you some questions about that. So is that, well, I mean, I feel like when new tech comes out, it's not that weird that you have issues with it. Like I never update my phone right away. Like I always give it like a week or so. So is this common that they have this
totally common? Like everyone likes to make a big deal about problems at launch, or you could talk about the inavailability of the parts at launch. Like I've been doing GPUs for long enough that I've seen, everything from the 20 series to the 10 series to the 900 series and the 700 series. Every one of them sells out right at launch, especially for Nvidia. The AMD RX 5000 series, at least the 5700 XT, those were selling out at launch. Same with the Vega cards at launch. So, this is not unheard of. And the thing is this is the biggest jump we've probably ever seen from Nvidia, or at least close to it. So it's a new architecture, a big jump in process technology, and they've got to do all the new drivers. So it's complex. I'm pretty sure, I don't have like photographic memory here, but I'm pretty sure I had crashing problems with the RTX 20 series at launch as well. There's just so much going on with the new architecture. So I'm not surprised. That's why I didn't want to jump to conclusions and be like, oh, it's totally the capacitors. The capacitors might have been partly to blame, but I think the bigger problem was it's a new GPU, new architecture, and the partners of Nvidia didn't seem like they got very much time to actually properly test and bin their own hardware. So they've got the cards and they're like, how fast can we clock them? We think we can go this fast. Then the drivers finally get out and it's like, oh, we're crashing. And so, you get this back and forth between them and Nvidia, and they all figure things out to try and like determine what's really causing the crashes and then hopefully tweak the drivers to fix it. So that seems to have happened. I won't say we're totally out of the woods yet, right? Like we'll probably still get driver updates that improve stability even more. So it's been exciting. And you still can't buy the cards for most people. So.
Right. Yeah. So that's another reason why we'll be okay. But
by the time you can get the cards, they'll work, right?
So what would you do, Michelle, if you got a 3090 somehow? The Lord's blessed you with a 3090.
What would I do if I got a 3090?
And it was crashing.
And it was crashing. Well, first thing, I'd upgrade my motherboard to actually work with a 3090. And it were crashing, I guess I'd play things that it's not crashing on.
Your motherboard should work. The problem would probably be your case fitting one of those things in it.
Yeah.
That's also true. I'm using a 1080 right now, and even that is a little bit of a stretch.
I mean, legitimately, the 3090 Founders Edition, every time I pick that up, I'm like, this is so heavy. It's like 2.2 kilograms, 4.5 pounds. And like, I've got an MSI card that weighs 1.5 kilograms. That feels heavy. But when you pick them both up, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so weighty.
I think I've seen a photo. Is it taller than an Xbox? I think, like the new Xbox.
It's about 12 inches tall, I want to say.
It's like you're stuffing a console into your computer.
Michelle measures things by consoles.
Yeah,
it probably uses more power than an Xbox will. I mean, I don't know. Like it's a 350 watt card, and it legitimately uses 350 watts. It's a monster in terms of power and performance and weight and everything else. So, yeah.
So we have some viewer questions. One is from Richie Raphael Rosinski's Triple R in the house. What's up? He would like to know why would you want to manually overclock your graphics card?
To get more performance. It's interesting. The Nvidia has been generally conservative on their memory clocks for a while. So like the 20 series, you had all these cards that had GDDR6 memory rated for 14 gigabits per second. And I think pretty much every one of those cards I tried to manually overclock the memory would hit 15.5 gigabits. Maybe a little less in some cases, but the memory had a lot of headroom. The 30 series cards, they're all hitting like 20.5 gigabits per second. So, stock is 19 or 19.5. So you've still got a good 10 to 15% headroom. I don't have the exact math in my head right now, but the GPU clocks, though, like it's again, you can get more performance, but every generation we get closer and closer to running at stock at close to the maximum frequency. And I think that's part of what's causing problems with Ampere is, with Pascal, it wasn't unheard of to get an extra 200, 300 megahertz out of the cards with overclocking. And that would have been like a, 10, 15, 20% boost maybe. Turing dropped that down a little bit. So instead of 200, 300 megahertz, you were probably getting 100 to 150. And with Ampere, I'm only seeing like 75 megahertz offsets. And that's not to say that the cards are running at their boost clocks. Like the Founders Edition boost clock is 1710, and in games it's usually running at closer to like 1850 to 1900 megahertz. So, you're by increasing the boost clock, you're trying to increase all of those clocks another 100 megahertz, and so it gets unstable. But you overclock for more performance is what it comes down to. You want to run faster.
That's why we do a lot of the things we do at Tom's
Yeah.
Hardware.
If the
It's what the
3090
enthusiasts do.
isn't strong enough for you already.
Yeah. Well, and if you're running professional apps and the 3090 isn't strong enough for what you do, it's probably because it's not a Titan and it's not a Quadro, and you need those special driver hooks enabled by Nvidia. And to do that, like the Quadro cards are pretty much the same GPU, same performance for only 5 times the money. I'm waiting to see. I think they're launching October 5th is when Nvidia is doing their GPU technology conference this year. It was delayed because of COVID, and they'll probably announce their Quadro cards at that, because GTC is all about like the high-end professional market. So it'll be interesting. I'm expecting Ampere Quadros to max out at $10,000.
And like 100 pounds or something.
No, they'll be the same basic design, I think, but they'll just be more expensive. Actually, they might change the cooler, because Quadro, you actually have reasons to run multiple GPUs. So that, I don't know. Well, PNY, I think, will do a blower version of a Quadro so that you can stick 2 or 3 or 4 of them in a workstation for deep learning.
Jared, somebody is asking about the MSI's Gaming X RTX 3080. That's not the one you're testing, is it?
Yes, it is. And I actually, it's back together, but I just took it apart today and took pictures, and I'm trying to put together a video of it. So this one was like, it's the second heaviest card I have after the 3090 Founders Edition, and I'm pretty sure it can easily handle a 3090 chip. So, it'll be the same basic card, just with more memory and a faster GPU on the 3090. I should show the back here. So the big question is, like, that's upside down. Here we go. Here we go. Sorry, I've got my NVIDIA broadcast is trying to frame my face, and it's not cooperating.
I was wondering if you had a camera operator on the other end.
I like it, but because it focuses. So this is your MLCC block, your multi-layer ceramic capacitors, and then next to them you see these 5 black blocks, and those are your SP caps, your standard tantalum whatever, or aluminum solid polymer capacitors. I don't even remember. I'm not an electrical engineer, guys, just so you know. You can go watch Bill Zoid or someone else talk about capacitors. But the MLCC block is considered generally superior, but it's more like different than absolutely superior in every way, because I believe MLCC is less tolerant of higher temperatures. So that may be a factor. Anyway, most of the cards that were having problems at factory stock settings, which were still overclocked, had more SP caps than they did MLCC blocks. And so there was a lot of speculation like that's the root cause. But I think some of the root cause was simply too much clock speed and a new architecture and new drivers.
Cool. So when do you think that review will be up? Because somebody's thinking about buying it.
If you can find one in stock, awesome. I wanted to have it done yesterday and then today, so hopefully by tomorrow I'll finish. I'm in process of writing it. Like I say, I don't always tear down graphics cards, because it's kind of a pain, and you always worry. You're like, am I going to break this $800 or $700 graphics card? But it's not super difficult. But I didn't do that on the Asus card. I didn't do it for the Founders Editions because, frankly, I was out of time. But this one, I'm like, well, it's late enough now. I've got time, so I pulled it apart and took some pictures and made a little video that I'm working on. But it's, you can probably find teardowns elsewhere, but it's nice card, and I think the cooler does a great job. It's nice and big, and gets plenty of airflow, so temperatures were topping out at like 61 degrees Celsius, whereas on the Founders Edition it was hitting 70 degrees Celsius, and both of those are fine. But the MSI and the Asus cards actually ran cooler, despite not having the super advanced Founders Edition cooler that Nvidia talked all this time about. And it's like all that talk about the Founders Edition cooler. It's like, well, it's because you guys wanted to do 2 fans instead of 3. I think. I don't know.
Well, we have another question. I'm going to throw it to Michelle. It's from Neo Rocket 001. They'd like to know, what is an Xbox and why would we care?
So an Xbox is this little known sort of indie project from a smaller company you might not have heard of called Microsoft. I don't know. They own this little indie game called Minecraft that just got into Smash Brothers today.
Sweet.
So it's a little niche, but it's pretty appreciated in the right circles.
Only like hipsters like Xbox.
Yeah.
It's not for Tom's Hardware though. No way.
No.
But what is for Tom's Hardware? Segue. Is Michelle has been testing Intel's latest mobile chips, 11th gen Tiger Lake, and I've been trying to come up with a tiger pun all day for a segue. Could not do it, but we have Michelle here to give us a rundown on Intel's latest mobile chips. So what's up, Michelle?
Well, so this week, we got 2 ZenBooks. This is the Asus ZenBook 13, which is the first computer that I've reviewed that has Tiger Lake in it. My colleague Andrew Friedman got the ZenBook Flip S, which also has Tiger Lake in it. The embargoes went up on those, I believe, yesterday, and we got those reviews out, so you can go read them on our site. We're looking forward to getting more Tiger Lake laptops, so we can get reviews of all stripes in. There you go, Sharon.
Thank you.
But right now, this is what we have to look at Tiger Lake with. It's a $1,000 machine, and it is about 1/2 an inch large. And because it's a ZenBook, it has to have, hold on a second, something special in the touchpad. So you can turn on a little touch activated.
How responsive is that?
Number pad. So it's only kind of responsive.
Okay.
When everything works fine, it works okay. But frequently I find that watch, it'll work fine here, but I'll bring up the calculator and it won't want to enter into the calculator, or I'll have the internet open and bring up the number pad and it won't want to enter it into a touch field. I find I have to sort of restart the number pad a lot and manually close the calculator, even though I should be able to swipe left to do it. But it's pretty unobtrusive and doesn't raise the price that much, so it's not a big deal. What's more exciting with this laptop, though, is that it is a Tiger Lake machine, which means it's replacing the Ice Lake ZenBook that we reviewed the Comet Lake ZenBook that we reviewed just earlier this year. And then Tiger Lake is Intel's mobile CPU line that's replacing Ice Lake. But what it overall means is it's able to achieve more than older ZenBooks used to do, but it also costs less, which is pretty neat. So when we put this ZenBook through our it has an i7 1165 G7 chip. And when we put it through its benchmarks, it got about 5,084 points in Geekbench, 16,000 about average in Cinebench. And if you compare that to the XPS 13 9300, which is like a $1,700 laptop with an i7 1065 G7, that got 4,848 in Geekbench and an average of about 1,257 in Cinebench. So this gives you more performance for way less. And granted, it's a different laptop SKU, But even if you look at the old ZenBook 13 that I reviewed in June that had a Comet Lake in it, that one only got about 3,297 in Geekbench. But it was about on par in Cinebench with about 1623. And then, of course, Tiger Lake is also debuting Intel Xe integrated graphics, as opposed to like Iris Plus or UHD. And that's about like one step below discrete GPUs. So it's not like going to work for a gaming machine, but in 3D Mark's Firestrike test on this computer, we got a score of about 4,400, which if you compare that to the Ice Lake XPS 13, that got a score of about 2,800. So that's a huge increase in performance. And this is on an Ultrabook too.
Yeah, and I mean, like, the thing is like Intel's integrated graphics have gone from being so horribly bad and slow, like, you know, they basically almost doubled performance with Ice Lake for certain workloads, and then they've almost doubled it again. And I think a big part of it is like your Tiger Lakes are currently TDP limited. If you could actually run those chips at like 35, 45 watts, I'd be really curious to see how fast the GPUs could run. But, you know, it sounds like they're getting pretty dang close to 1050 levels of performance now, which isn't like a top of the line graphics card, but it's serviceable for playing most games at 1080p. So that's pretty good for an all-in-one integrated graphics solution.
Exactly. So I ran some graphics benchmarks on this, even though it is definitely not a gaming computer, earlier today. And in Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p on its lowest settings, I got 26 FPS, which 26 FPS average, which is still a little bit below the 30 that we consider to be playable. But if you're willing to do 720p, you can bump that up to 38 FPS. And, you know, if you pair this Tiger Lake CPU with, you know, a larger machine, better cooling, you might be able to bump that performance up even, you know, more. This is a very thin and light PC we're talking about.
That's actually one of the things I wanted to ask you, because that's, you know, sometimes they come out with these great new mobile chips where they don't get the greatest like laptops to put them in. So how is the lineup, the selection of Tiger Lake laptops looking so far?
So the two that we looked at this week are interesting because the ZenBook 13 that I reviewed and the ZenBook Flip S that Andrew reviewed share the same CPU, the same RAM, I believe the same SSD, or at least the same SSD capacity, if not. But the performance was drastically different. It's like I got 5,084 in Geekbench. He got 3,880 in Geekbench. I got about a 1,600 average in Cinebench. He got about a 1,200 average. So the computer that you put this in is also going to affect performance a lot. And because it's still early on, we don't have a lot of computers with Tiger Lake set out yet. But even in October, the Asus VivoBook Flip 14 is set to come out. And then also MSI, bringing them back up again, is entering the business market with a couple of laptops meant for sort of professional work and things that you can show off to your colleagues without getting embarrassed by a big dragon logo on the back. It's the Summit E series and the Summit B series. And then I was comparing this to the XPS 13 earlier, but of course it's not strictly fair. That's an old Ice Lake XPS, but the new XPS 13 with Tiger Lake. It's also expected for end of the year, although we don't have like a specific month announcement on that yet.
Very cool. So if anyone has any questions, remember, put them in the chat. We'll try to get through them. Michelle and Jared, while Michelle was talking, we got a Facebook like, so there's something to be happy
Someone
about.
liked us.
So keep the questions coming. I'm gonna I see we have one here now. from Travis and Mickleberry. They want to know, when will OLED PC gaming monitors ever come out so I can be happy and stop using my 21-inch CRT as my primary gaming monitor?
Honey.
I feel bad for anyone still using a CRT. I mean, like, I left those behind me.
Unless you're in the Smash Brothers Melee community.
Also, there is Alienware does have an OLED monitor you could buy now. It's 55 inches. It was like, I want to say it was $4,000 when it came out, but it just had a price cut, so it might be a little bit cheaper, but probably still at least a couple $1,000s. And I seen a follow-up comment. They were looking for something like in the 20 to 30 range, 27 or 32 inch. And I know ViewSonic is also coming out with a 55-inch OLED, presumably the same panel, right? In the Alienware. I don't know why they're not doing the smaller versions. I guess because OLED is right now, OLED 4K is kind of like serving as a TV replacement. So that's why they're marketing the big ones.
They had some OLED displays years ago. I want to say, like, I was at CES probably 2014, 15, where they showed off a 24-inch OLED that it was like a prototype from Sony or somebody, and they said, oh, it's worth like $20,000. But I think they've had some OLED computer displays, but basically it's economies of scale where they're like, hey, we sell, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, millions or whatever of TVs, and they don't sell as many computer monitors. So they've moved to the larger sizes for OLED, which is kind of opposite of what you'd expect. I mean, it's like you can buy a 4K 65-inch TV for, $250, $300, whatever these days, and then you go, well, what's the cheapest 4K monitor I can buy? And it's going to be $300 to $400. You're like, why? It's only 24, 28 inches. I don't know. I mean, the TVs aren't always great for gaming either, but they're usually serviceable. So
they actually have an exact model. They're gaming on a 21-inch compact V1100 CRT.
Man, I can't even remember what my old monitor was. I had a 21-inch 1600 by 1200 monitor back in 1995. I bought it for like $600, and it had the like BNC connectors that you would then run to a VGA port, and I loved that thing because it could do 75 hertz. It was like, gosh, what was the brand? Color something. It wasn't like a super well-known brand, but it was actually a professional monitor that you could pick up for a decent price, and it weighed, I want to say it weighed 85 to 95 pounds.
Wow.
See, in 1995, I had an Etch-a-Sketch because I was 4 years old.
Wait, Travis is so interesting. So Travis also has the Asus PG270Q, which is a fantastic monitor. I'm pretty sure that's the one with the fall backlight, like amazing HDR. And he says it's garbage compared to CRT.
I guess it depends on what you're doing. Like, man, my CRT days, when I left those behind, I was so glad to get rid of pin cushioning and trapezoidal distortion and all the other things that you dealt with on the old CRT projections and get a truly flat display. I know refresh rates weren't as good, and you still get pixel response was much faster on your, scanning electron guns, lighting up the phosphors instead of using LCDs. But I don't know, man. I just can't go back to CRT. Every time I even see one, I'm like, wow, that is so old school. Sorry, Travis.
Fold. I don't know if that's what people really. It's full array local dimming. It refers to the backlight. Now they're saying fold. I don't know if they're just messing with me now. They might be. I don't know.
I don't really like the dynamic dimming. I will agree on that. Like it can be okay, but you get the things that like blink on and dim and light up based on what's on the screen, and it's sometimes distracting. The more arrays you have, the better it gets, but ultimately you end up at OLED where it's like, hey, every pixel is its own little light source. Yeah.
Maybe we should bring Travis on to recommend CRTs for us.
Best CRT monitors.
Yeah, for 2020.
Best CRT. I'm surprised he doesn't have the 24-inch Sony. What was that one called. I can't remember the model anymore, but there was a 24-inch Sony CRT back around late 90s or early aughts that was, it might have even been a widescreen, like a 1920 by 1200 monitor, but it was big and people loved it.
By the time I was like actually working like with PCs and stuff, CRTs were a thing of the past. You know, that was what I used with my Sega Genesis.
Sega. So we have another question. I think Jared, you'd be a good person to answer this if you could. From Mario, they'd like to know if they could use an 8700K overclocked and keep up with a 3080 or even a 3090.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely can. There's going to be instances where it might be fractionally slower, but especially like if you're buying a 3080, you really should be thinking about 4K gaming, or at the very least 1440p. And you could say, oh well, I'm using ray tracing and I don't want to do DLSS maybe, but in general, I think you should be using a higher resolution monitor. And in that case, I did some testing. If you go look it up on Tom's Hardware, I've got a bunch of tests that I ran the 3080 Founders Edition through, I think, 6 or 8 GPUs. And I did everything from a 4770K up through a 10900K, Ryzen 9 3900X, and Ryzen 5 3600, and then like the 9900K and an i5. What did I do? I think I did an i5 10400. I don't even remember now. But the basic result was you had up to like a 50 or 60% delta if you were running at 1080p medium. But by the time you were at 4K, only the 4770K was significantly slower, and it was only like 5 to 10% slower, whereas like the Ryzen 3rd gen stuff and the 8th and 9th and 10th gen Intel CPUs were all within 2 or 3% of each other, and that's margin of error. So, if you're running 4K, you can certainly buy a 3080, 3090 and run it at run games and not end up massively CPU limited. At the same time, if you have the money to spend $1,500 on a 3090, I'm like, you can probably go ahead and buy the $500 CPU and motherboard upgrade to go with it, because otherwise I'm like, run a 3080 with whatever you've got, and if you want the 3090, maybe upgrade your whole system and get a 3080 instead.
I mean, that's hard. So much money to spend. It's kind of like, who was saying this? Maybe it was Janae Benet last week, but it's like you get hooked on this one component and then all of a sudden you have to start spending more on your CPU, on your monitor, and you just are in like this. It's like a mountain.
I can't remember the last time I upgraded my power supply too, but these things are also power hungry, right?
This is true, and power supplies degrade over time. I mean, if you've got an 8-year-old system like my 4770K, that's got a power supply. It's a PC, what is it, Power and Cooling, I think is the brand. I think they've gone out of business since then, or they got sold off or whatever, but it was a top of the line power supply back in 2013 or something, and it's 850 watts, and I was still kind of sketchy. I was like, is this going to actually supply 320 watts to a graphics card? It seemed to do okay, but if you were overclocking your CPU or running like a 10900K, I definitely wouldn't want to pair that up with anything less than 1,000 watts. Like if you think about it, 10900K, it's a 250 watt maximum power, but in reality, it can exceed that. And so you're like 300 watts for your CPU, 350 to 400 watts for your GPU, depending on which 3090. And you can get up to where you're like using 800 to 900 watts, and at that point I'm like, yeah, you better have a 1200 watt just to be on the safe side. But if you're going with the 3080, I'm like, yeah, I think 850 watt is probably sufficient. Don't plan on serious overclocking.
Yeah, the computer that I'm working on right now actually uses, I believe, a 650 watt PSU and an i7, either 6th or 7th gen. So again, if I got a 3090, the first thing I would do is start building.
I've got a little, it's called a kilowatt power meter that's plugged in at the outlet. So it measures whole system power. Like it doesn't take into account power efficiency of your PSU or anything. I've been like eyeing that while running benchmarks, and even on the 3090, and granted, I'm running stock CPU, stock 3090 or factory overclocks 3090s too, but I don't think I've seen actual wall power go above 550 watts.
Okay.
But
But
there's potentially transient spikes in power load. So it's like, hey, it might be averaging 550 watts or less if you're looking at 1 second intervals, but you might get this brief like spike for a fraction of a second up to more than that. And so, there's a concern that that could cause instability as well. That was one of the things that people were talking about. Did Nvidia like work on tuning the drivers so that their clock speeds and voltage spikes and things like that were smoothed out, because those might have been causing crashes.
does the 3080, the 3090, do those come with like discounted plans from your power company, or like?
You would hope so, right?
It actually makes me think, like, how much of the 3080, 3090 market do you think is going to be taken up by crypto miners?
The 3090, no one doing mining should buy a 3090. Like, it's just so expensive. Like, it does 105 mega hash per second in ETH hash or Dagger Hashimoto algorithm, whatever you want to call it, Ethereum's algorithm, right? But I mean, and some people are saying like with tuned miners, they're getting up to 150 mega hash, and it's like at current prices, I think that works out to maybe $5 per day. I'm like, that's 500 days, or what is that? 300 days minimum to break even, and cryptocurrency is just so volatile. I'm like, I think the 3080 is a safer bet if you were to do mining, but even that, I don't know. I hope the cryptocurrency market just doesn't treat the miners well, because I don't want to repeat of 2017.
Are gonna finally get seized back by the gamers.
Yeah, I by the bots.
Oh, true. That's another thing.
Well, so keep the questions coming. We'll try to get to some more questions before the end of the show. But I want to show you all what I've been working on this week. Jared has his Extreme graphics card, and Michelle's the cool new Extreme mobile chips. Well, I have an Extreme gaming mouse, guys, if anyone cares. So this week, Razer, for reasons not like fully known, they have some explanation as to why, but they released or announced that they are working on a gaming mouse with an 8,000 hertz polling rate. So most mice, especially like gaming mice, most of them currently have a 1,000 hertz polling rate, meaning every second it's sending to your computer its position 1,000 times every second. It's sending 1,000 reports every second. So this mouse is supposed to be doing it 8,000 times. I have the mouse. So this is the mouse. This is just a prototype. They put it in the shell of a Razer Viper, a mouse they currently do so. So this is just a prototype, but I've been using it a little bit. And so the idea behind it is we're getting these new monitors going up to 360 hertz now, right? And so that's their argument. Like 1,000 hertz literally isn't going to cut it, they said. So they're trying to up everything, make faster response, faster everything. So this mouse is supposed to have a 0.125 to 0.25 millisecond delay. So that's how long between when I press a button to when the computer understands that I press a button. So that's like a quarter of a millisecond versus 2 to 3 for a high-end mouse. Jared's already laughing because we're talking like tiny.
What's the quote from Data and Star Trek Next Generation to an android? That is virtually an eternity.
So
that's the only thing I can think of, because it's like none of us would, like, especially as you get into your 30s and 40s. I'm like, I don't think any of us are.
Yeah, I don't think I can click Sharon? That fast.
Do you notice a difference when using it?
So when using it, no. So I don't have the fastest monitor I had on hand to try this with is 240. I mean, we theoretically with 360, it would have been a whole new thing. So I did some like anecdotal testing. So obviously, like Razer, when they showed it to me, they had a machine moving mice at the exact same way, but that's obviously not how I as a human, use my mouse. So I was using it, my way, trying to keep my movements equal and whatnot. So I did a few tests. So like when my delay between pressing and the input, like how I use it, I was able to get it down to 4.2 milliseconds and like 4.4 to 4.8 with the other mice, the 1000 hertz mice. The best example I would say is there's this test, and you could do it too. It's like just a reaction time test. It's called human benchmark. So it's like also testing my own reflexes. But again, the mouse is an extension of you. So you have a red screen and it changes to a different color and you're supposed to click. And they time how long it took for your computer to know you clicked. So the shortest time I got was actually with the prototype. It was 166 milliseconds, but I did that twice. And the other mouse, the lowest I got was 168 milliseconds.
Ooh, 2 milliseconds.
Yes.
I mean, like this is the interesting thing when people talk about latency and stuff. It's like our brains are actually really they're great at doing like these big picture stuff, but in terms of latency, they're not super fast. Like they're usually about a 10th to 20th of a second response minimum, and you're like, man, why are we worrying about half a millisecond and stuff? But I suppose
short, Jared.
if you're a fighter pilot or an extreme professional gamer or something, maybe it matters.
Yeah, everyone likes that. That's the dream, though, is one day you can become an extreme professional gamer if you just get good enough at Overwatch.
I'm 20 years too late.
By the time you get good enough at Overwatch will be like out of season. I used to use Human Benchmark when Overwatch came out to test different mice and also to test to make sure that like my USB hub wasn't slowing down my connection, because I used a hub back then instead of connecting it directly to the computer. And I think that whenever I had an error, it was mostly in between the monitor and the chair, but
it's a PEBCAC. Problem exists between chair and computer.
So, I mean, I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think a lot of other things are going to come into play, like how they actually build the mouse. They're committed to using their optical mechanical switches that definitely feel different than standard mechanical ones. It's going to come down to how easy it is to move the mouse around, stuff like that. But I did see a 2 millisecond difference, guys.
Yeah. I always find it funny.
Gamer, that might matter.
Yeah,
I always find it funny.
But it really might.
Someone better than you, for sure. So this is something they're actually releasing. They don't have a date, but they said the technology is ready enough that they could release it right now, but they just want to refine it a bit more. So, Michelle, you game a decent amount. Is your interest peaked at all?
I don't know. I've been using Logitech G4, trying to get it on camera, G402 Hyperion Fury since like 2016. It's super outdated at this point. But
can you show it again? I want to see it.
Oh, sure. It's connected through a mouse bungee.
Okay.
So it's a little outdated,
too.
But it meets.
Oh, I see it. I thought it was a DVD.
Nice. We have the box.
I bought like 3 of these on Black Friday for $23 a piece, I think.
It's basically like a budget G502. Although the version I'm using is from 2016. So the G502s have had their hardware updated for a while now. Like they're on the Hero brand or whatever, but it's a pretty respected mouse. And again, I'm maybe a bit of even at 29, a bit of a boomer for this, but I don't notice much of a difference on my clicks. And between this and like the more recent mice I've been reviewing recently, like for millisecond polling stuff, I'm more so worried about comfort and features and button placement and stuff like that. And I always find it funny when these mice also advertise super high DPI or CPI, however you prefer to say it, because as far as I understand, most of the pro players that people are looking to emulate play on fairly low DPI because it allows them greater sensitivity. And so it's actually more important is having more desk space and larger mouse pads to support that increased like arm movement you have to do with lower DPI.
It's like they want you to have pro skills, but not using pro tactics.
I often do wonder though, like if you have a mouse capable of 16,000 CPI, DPI, whatever, but you run it at 1,000, say, does it
Does
feel
it make
better
it
than a
better? Yeah.
1,000
Like
DPI mouse?
when you're running when your monitor can only support like 144 hertz, but your computer can run the game at 200 hertz or so, and then supposedly that helps with input lag. I'm not enough of a mouse expert to know, and Razer, please keep sending us mice. We love them, but at a certain point, I try not to blame the controller.
Yeah, that's a good point. At what time do you say, "Hey, I'm just like average at video games," huh?
Yeah. I went on a bit of in 2016 when Overwatch came out. I went on a bit of a Gamer Gear binge, and I maybe rose 200 points in rank, but I don't know if that gear had anything to do with it or just playing the game more.
I mean, I do think in extreme cases, like the 360 hertz monitor, and you'll have to stay tuned because our review is coming for that. I didn't review it personally, but our reviewer did actually see a difference. They probably identify as like an average skill level gamer, and they did feel like they were able to react better because those blurry scenes weren't
versus
blurry.
240 or versus 144 or what?
Well, he is our monitor reviewer, so he does all of them. He only does so we mostly do gaming monitors. So most monitors he reviews are 144 hertz, and maybe like I'm just estimating maybe like a fourth to a third of them are 240. So he's pretty, he's used to the high refresh.
Monitors I make an exception for. Even if they don't make me better, higher refresh rates just look nicer to me. And I can't go below 60 FPS anymore.
You're not a boomer anymore.
I've got a 144 hertz monitor, and I'm debating getting a new one. And all the 4K ones are mostly still 60 hertz, which I understand it's hard to do 4K and higher refresh rates at this point. But that's the big divider, isn't it? 4K or like 300 hertz.
Well, the PG27UQ does 4K 144 hertz, but
can my computer do it?
Like it. Oh, that's
even the 3090. There's games where it can do 144 FPS at 4K, but there's also games where it's only getting like 70, 80 frames per second. So that's where Nvidia would tell you to use G-Sync or G-Sync compatible stuff. But yeah.
So if anyone out there who thinks they can make good work out of an 8,000 hertz polling rate mouse, our article is up. I wrote it, so check it out. You can see a little bit more of the numbers I got and compare it against a couple high-end wired mice. So let's see if we have any questions. We do have one. We don't have our CPU guy here, Paul Alcorn, but we can give this a swing. I'm sure Jared probably has some opinions. The question is, how much of a performance increase do you expect from the Zen 3 AMD CPUs coming out compared to Intel Comet Lake and the Zen 2 chips? What do you expect also of the 11th gen Intel desktop chips that are not here yet? Michelle talked about 11th gen mobile, but this is all desktop now.
That's a lot of questions. And the reality is we don't know for sure. But I mean, Zen 3, it's going to your unified cache per CCX block, so it will have a bigger L3 cache that's unified. I'm drawing a blank on how it's all configured. I think right now you've got an 8-core chip with 2 shared L3 caches on Zen 2. I might have that wrong. Maybe it's a unified L3 per 8 cores, and then if you go to 16 cores, you end up with 2 blocks of L3 cache. But it has changed over time. And each change, like unifying your cache into one big chunk, usually reduces latency, or it also reduces your variability in latency, which is probably the bigger problem, because if you have 2 CCX blocks and this one needs cache or data that's cached over here, it takes longer for it to go over and hop over and pull that data out. So it will have better latency. That's one of the things most people feel like holds back AMD's Zen chips a little bit in gaming applications. And if you're looking at a 360 hertz monitor and you really are hoping to get 360 FPS or more, obviously the game you play will be a big factor as well, because certain games you're not going to get that fast of a frame rate no matter what you do. But anyway, Zen 3, like I'm excited to see it. we'll find out about it next week, is when AMD is taking off the full wraps and telling us hopefully all the low-level details, pricing, availability, and all that. I expect it will be closer to, if not better than, Comet Lake. Rocket Lake is a different story, because Rocket Lake is the new architecture. It's got the it's not Sunny Cove, it's the not Golden Cove, Willow Cove.
Don't you just
So many
love
coves.
these nicknames? I see you've
Yeah.
got a nickname on your shirt right now for
Superfin.
Tiger Lake.
I wore that because of Tiger Lake today.
The
except that was
superfin
yesterday.
sharks are in the ice
Yeah.
lakes, and
if you look down, like the 1 and the 0, I don't know, it's covered up by text, but the 10. Anyway,
superfin is the 10 nanometer process that they're making Tiger Lake with.
It's 10 nanometer plus technically for Intel, but they've stopped using pluses because that was getting confusing to track. And so they just call it, yeah. I mean, because like 14 nanometer, they were onto 4 pluses, but they stopped at 2. So they refined it 2 more times, but they didn't tell us about it. It's kind of like, speaking of Nvidia, they use Samsung's 8N process that's optimized for Nvidia. That's actually 10 nanometer LP 4 pluses. Like, that's kind of, we don't know exactly how it compares, but I would have loved to have seen the GA102 chip build on TSMC. I don't think Nvidia wanted to pay that, and I don't think TSMC necessarily had the capacity to manufacture enough in short time. But anyway, back to Intel. Rocket Lake is going to be interesting because it's still 14 nanometer. Like, oh my gosh, in 2021 we will have a new 14 nanometer chip, but it will be a new architecture. So I don't know. I mean, like, Intel's 14 nanometer was really good, and with refinements, it's gotten better. But Intel's 14 nanometer, even with all those refinements, is probably only getting up to the level of a good 10 nanometer solution. So it's still a jump to your good 10 nanometer and your good 7 nanometer and stuff. So they're still behind. I think we could see close to parity in terms of per core performance in games from Zen 3. That's kind of what I hope, because it's funny because people say, well, AMD is better than Intel at multitasking in certain workloads, but I mean, I play games a lot. I don't ever do much in the way of 3D rendering other than run benchmarks, and I do some video editing on occasion, so it's like, yeah, the more cores of AMD does have occasional benefits, but if you tell me I can get 10 to 20% better gaming performance versus 20% better multi-threaded performance, I would take the gaming performance personally. So that's where I think AMD needs to close the gap, and I hope Zen 3 does it.
Well, typically you're not doing like Adobe Premiere Pro competitively. So
typically when it's like when you do your video output, I'm not enough of a professional video person where I'm like, oh man, come on, go faster video and code. Mm-hmm. So it's like I walk away.
That's when you go make your tea. And
yeah, I go make a sandwich, come back, hey, it's done. Doesn't matter whether it took 30 minutes or 5 minutes. It finished before I got back.
So we have a couple more questions that I want to get to before our show ends. One of them is for Jared. Jared, do you think we are I think you might have answered this a little bit before, but maybe you just, go through it quickly again. Do you think we are actually held back on performance on the 3080, 3090 on current top-end CPUs from Intel and AMD?
At 1080p, absolutely. At 1440p, somewhat. At 4K, not really. I mean, like, based on what we tested, it's like, well, if the Core i5 and the Core i7 and the Core i9 and the Ryzen 5 and the Ryzen 9 all perform within like this tiny little gap at 4K Ultra, it says your bottleneck is the GPU. And of course, if you're playing a game that does ray tracing, it pushes the bottleneck to the GPU even more. But there's that question, like, we only have PCI Express Gen 4 support on AMD, and and we don't have it on Intel, and we know that Intel's faster for gaming still, especially at lower resolutions. So Rocket Lake will have PCIe Gen 4. It will have a new architecture. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a few percent performance uplift at 4K with like a 3090, but generally speaking, I think we're still GPU limited if you're playing at higher resolutions.
Then I want to throw our next question to Michelle. It's a pretty hard one. Do you think we should get CPUs with RGB lighting?
Do you have an open case? I don't know. I've never been a huge fan of RGB lighting, but
But
I
don't
think he
see
means,
one.
are you talking on the chip though? Swan?
Yeah, like see the socket, or
It'd have to be around the socket, because like you got to put the heatsink on top of the chip, so any lighting would get
figure
hidden.
it out. Someone will figure it out. Don't worry.
That's why motherboards have RGB lighting.
Can you get like little battery powered LEDs in the thermal cooling paste, and then like a see-through heatsink? I'm talking nonsense.
Okay, but if you had to have RGB, the CPU is the heart of the computer, the most important part, shouldn't it?
That's right.
The
It would make it go faster for sure, Tuan. Like if you had RGB, if you guys don't know, Tuan's actually my old boss. I think he used to be editor-in-chief at Tom's Hardware for a while.
For our time. Well, hey, Tuan.
It would have been like, what, 8-10 years ago? I don't know. But yeah, RGB lighting, it's interesting because it's a lot of people, it's love it or hate it, but you have to use it in the right spot. I mean, like, I like your idea though, see-through coolers. You figure out a thermally conductive see-through cooler, you could make bank off of that, Michelle.
Well, Guru2M points to Ryzen stock coolers with RGB. That's one way to help flash up your chip.
Yeah.
Does that count?
There's a lot
as
of
the
coolers
CPU?
that have it, but not the CPU itself.
But it'll help you in the meantime while we figure out how to get the LEDs in the thermal paste. Michelle will be back next week showing us how to get LEDs in our thermal paste.
Well, you need to get a bedazzler gun and no.
3D printed RGB CPU paste.
I'm going to introduce gamers to fairy lights, and then they can just hang them around their laptops, put little mason jars, and it'll be fine.
You're definitely not a boomer.
Mason jar water cooling. That's the next step.
So I think we've got through a lot of our questions. Definitely thank you everyone who sent in a question. We'll be back next week and you can ask us more questions, of course. So I want to thank our awesome guests, Jared and Michelle. Thank you so much for coming by and hanging out.
Thanks for
I'll have that
us.
MSI review tomorrow, I promise.
You said on video, so.
I know, I've committed.
And
you can read the ZenBook 13 review on our site, tomshardware.com, if you didn't know.
Yes, and we will be back here next week. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook. We got 2 likes today, guys. 2. Whoa. Yeah. So subscribe to our channel, like us on Facebook. You can also download every episode after the fact as a podcast and take it with you. So thank you for everyone who tuned in, and that's our show. We'll see you next Thursday.
Bye.
Bye.